Welcome to the weekly update on the state of the nation, sponsored by our friends from Pace Car Rental. Go to their website when you need to rent a car, use the code SONA, S-O-N-A, and get a discount the next time you hire a car. Help them out. They sponsor the show. They've been doing it for a while, and they need all the support we can give them. So, nice controversial topic today. The DA has proposed a bill to replace black economic empowerment in South Africa. Now, boy, nothing gets people looking the other way faster than talking about BEE in South Africa, especially if you happen to be white. But you know the state of the nation. We're not overly scared to tackle topics. Let's talk about BEE because I don't think it gets spoken about enough. You've got a few sides to this argument. One side extremely defensive, the other side extremely closed off to the realities of South Africa. So let's have a deep dive into BEE, how we got here, whether we need it, and whether it is time for BEE to be put out to pasture. So let's have a look back at South Africa. And here I'm going to use specifically South Africa. We're going to get into our time tunnel, go back to 1990. Okay, that period, 1990, before the elections of 1994. And let's have a look at what South Africa looked like at that point in time. Right, and if you came into South Africa from outer space, what you would have seen is you would have seen an economy that was quite sophisticated, quite developed. Most parts of urban South Africa resembled European countries, very well developed. And this was developed largely on the back of money that flowed into the country because of mining. Right? As we all know, South Africa built on a mountain of gold, coal, platinum, diamonds, you name it, we had it. And the time that it gets discovered in the 19th century, you've got strong colonial powers with greater technical understanding and industrial machinery, and South Africa becomes a haven for investment. Right now we are talking about the 19th century, a different world. Right, when this is happening in South Africa, the world is not the world we see today. So what happens? A big settler community emerges in South Africa, European, white, come into the country and they start mining. But they do something that you wouldn't expect today. You've got to look at it through the lens of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Those communities settled in South Africa. They didn't just come in as you could do today. Go and mine, or you call it the oil rig economy, where you go, you're on a platform, you take this oil out of the ground, and you all leave and go somewhere else. No, the settlers settled. They stayed here and built cities and built a flourishing economy for whites only. And the country did benefit from that mining because great infrastructure was built. If you were fortunate enough to be part of the class of white people that had been at the forefront of the economy. So that's what confronted our, if you look at the politicians that came out of exile, came back to South Africa, they would have seen quite a developed formal economy. Where were blacks? Black South Africans were found largely in two places. In townships, as working class people in low-skilled jobs on the outskirts of the cities, or else they were in rural communities. You had all sorts of terrible legislation that kept people apart, kept blacks out of white areas, and they did not benefit from the fruits of a lot of that wealth that had been generated in the preceding 100 years. In 1990, the South African population was about 35 million people. 69% of that 35 million were black South Africans. 19% of that were white South Africans. 9% colored, about 3% Indians out of this population of 35 million. Not the country we see today, nearly twice the size. So, as now South Africa was heading towards what we now know as the new South Africa, there were a few options, political options. So let's have a look at what those options were. Well, in the preceding 2 decades, we had seen a lot of independence in South Africa, and especially in Southern Africa, where it was sort of narrowed down to call it the Mozambique option and call it the Zimbabwean option. The Mozambican option, 1975, after a bit of a messy civil war, Mozambique has its first election, get won by Frelimo, staunchly Marxist, staunchly communist country. They give the white community, largely expatriate Portuguese, sort of days to get out of there with the clothes on their back. Many of them came into South Africa. Right? A similar thing happened in the Congo, where in the case of the Congo, a Belgian expatriate community was expelled almost immediately. In both cases, it led to economic catastrophe, where the economies literally collapsed. Nobody could run the businesses that had been set up. The country was then engulfed in civil war because people were fighting over the spoils. So that became a lesson for how not to behave after independence when you have a white community. The other example I mentioned was Zimbabwe, where in many cases it resembled fairly closely to what happened in South Africa. And Zimbabwe gained its independence in 1980 and chose an integrated model to sort of work with the white community to let those businesses continue. And for many years, Zimbabwe was the poster child for the better way to deal with post-independence. And it carried on in Zimbabwe until there's a second part to the Zimbabwe story, which we all know now. But the first 10, 15 years of Zimbabwe's life was very, very successful. The country got very wealthy. The population grew. It got healthier. All sorts of things happened. The problem was political one. ZANU, as they slipped from power, this is Robert Mugabe's power, so they found a very easy scapegoat, and that was the white minority. And then the story changes from there on. In 1990, though, Zimbabwe was a good example of how to deal with it. What were the global issues in 1990? Well, the global issues, which probably led to the changes in South Africa, was by far one of the biggest things that had happened in post-Second World War in the whole political scene, was the end of the Cold War. How did that end? We all remember in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down as the visible sign between the communist East versus the capitalist West, where, the focal point being post-war Germany. And the Soviet Union, as it was called then, which was the constellation of all those states east of Germany, and it formed a big union, and the original home of communism basically fell in under the weight of its own inconsistencies. Basically, the system collapsed. Basically, they went bankrupt. Really, they were way behind in terms of technology and innovation, and they couldn't afford to run the lives they were living. And the problem with communism, you run out of other people's money. We know the story. The state pays for everything, and the state was unable to generate the money to run for everything. So the Soviet Union had fallen. The West had prevailed at that point in time. South Africa was now heading towards a new country. But there was an interesting dynamic. The ANC were the most popular party in South Africa, and their allies were the Soviet Union. And now the ANC are about to win this particular battle, called South Africa, while the Allies had lost the big war. And now they had to live in a world run by their ideological enemies, the West. And the West was running a free market, liberal, democratic system with free markets. At the same time, Francis Fukuyama famously was writing his book, The End of History and the Last Man. Basically, if ever, I feel so sorry for the guy because he came out with this book that was very, very popular, but it sort of sits there now forever known as the book saying, you shouldn't talk too soon. Anyway, the point is that at that point, it looked like Western-style liberal democracy, free markets were in the ascendancy. And the ANC were about to win, but their allies had lost. What do you do now about the economy in South Africa? Well, the first move actually came from business, not from the old South African government or the impending new South African government or afterwards. Business could see that they had to get into self-defense mode. Remember, South Africa had quite an advanced economy and business got into the act quickly. They came up with the mechanism of BEE, Black Economic Empowerment. Basically, it was a bribe. There is no nice way to put it. It's a bribe. These big corporates, the big mining groups that still had mega businesses in South Africa, could see that the only way that they could protect their interests was to co-opt some of the politically connected in the country and get them onto their boards, give them shares in the company, so that those politically connected people could protect those big companies from the masses and from anybody who gets the idea of nationalizing anything or turning South Africa into Mozambique 2.0. And it worked. It worked brilliantly because you had people like Cyril Ramaphosa being the poster child for this, who was very prominent. He was the Secretary General of the ANC and he left that position to go and become a board member of many big companies. And his job was to do nothing. Just sit there, be black. That was your job. Make the odd call to government so government didn't mess too much in the business of your particular business. And so we saw many leading lights within the ANC leaving politics and getting into business. They called it being deployed to business. And the first generation of BEE operators made obscene amounts of money. That's why they're billionaires. They weren't billionaires because they stole money. They were billionaires because it was given to them. And they took no risk. As I said, they added very little value. But of course, everybody was watching this and saying, well, geez, if they can do it, why can't I do it? Well, the problem was that there weren't that many people needed because there were only, sort of a couple of companies listed and you could have directorships in multiple companies. Suddenly, there's not going to be these sweetheart deals that the first round of BE entrepreneurs found so lucrative. The only way that the government could see a way to include more people in on this grift was to introduce hard-hitting BEE legislation. In other words, force all companies to give a portion to somebody who's politically connected. So in other words, if the whole economy gets in on this game, then maybe it could work. And that law was subsequently passed in 2003, came into effect in 2004, and they added a few more letters to it to call it BBBEE, Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment. The idea being, or the sales pitch being, that this is going to transform the economy. Now suddenly we had more scorecards, more admin to do, more companies were affected by this, and it's the world we live in today. Right? Now, was it all bad? No, definitely not. And we must acknowledge some of the good work that BEE has done, because it has done something. It forced the big white economy as it was pre-1990, and it was a white economy with the only black participation being at very low skilled level. no decision making, not using the talents of black people. But the wealth was going to the white community, and it was a recipe for disaster. BE did help to broaden the participation in the economy. And nobody can dispute that it has helped. The economy we see today is not the economy we would have seen if you had arrived here, 30, 40 years ago. It looked very, very different. I know, I lived in that world. Very white world. You went to the Joburg CBD, it was a white place, right? All those offices manned by white people. In fact, the problem was that we were running out of white people to employ. So we needed to broaden skilled labor anyway. But we're now touching onto the bigger crisis. Because of apartheid, there was a lack of skilled black people. They had been dealt a terrible deal with the Bantu education, as it was called, where the education standards of blacks was on purpose inferior to that of whites. Their development was poor. They had, I think there were 2 black universities in the whole country. And we had a massive shortage of skilled black people in 1990, and this continued to dog the economy. Like I said, in 2004, BBBEE comes into force, and suddenly everybody's forced to do what the big companies found so easy. Now, I just want to touch on that for a second, because it was pretty easy for big companies to give away shares, because they were listed companies. You didn't know who your shareholders were anyway. So if you're going to give away 10% or 20%, whatever the number is, hell, you don't even know who's holding your share certificate anyway. And you only at that point had black representation on your board. They weren't operational. Very different for a smaller company that's maybe got 2 or 3 directors. And companies were being forced to comply. And in some cases, it didn't work at all. But everybody was being forced to do the same thing. And the big stick and the big carrot was, if you do a deal, you can get more business. If you don't do a deal, you can get excluded, especially when it came to government contracts. So roll forward. It has the net effect of doing what? It has the net effect of stifling entrepreneurship. Because now nobody wants to start a company where you have, I'm talking about from a white perspective, where you have 100% of the risk, but you have to give away 25, 26%, in some cases 50% of your company. You're the person who took all the risk. So that was problematic. And then to me, the bigger problem is, if you were black, why would you become an entrepreneur? If you're smart enough, you could get one of those high-paying corporate jobs, which they needed to employ black people to comply with this legislation, or you could go work for government and get a higher paying job there. Why would you take the risk of being an entrepreneur? So it literally, from the late 2000s into the 2010s, the 2010s and onward, we've seen a literal decimation of small and medium enterprises in this country, because nobody is incentivized to start a business. Because you've got this pile of admin you need to comply with. The bigger class that should be opening these businesses, i.e. entrepreneurial black people, are being snapped up by white corporates who need to comply with legislation, and whites are doing one of 3 things. Either they're getting old, or they don't want to take the risk, or they're immigrating. So here we stand, 2025, and the economy is doing terribly. We are so far behind, it's ridiculous. We've got 50% unemployment, and the demographics have changed. We now have 65 million South Africans, and only 7% of them are white. Okay, that's down from 17% in 1990. But the legislation is still written the same as if the whites still owned the economy, which they don't. Now, why I would argue that it is time for us to change the law is the following. Quite simply, one of the perverse successes of apartheid was psychological, was to get blacks to think that they were inferior to white people when they weren't. It was terrible, and it worked. Now you've got a black government that's telling black people that they're not good enough to start their own businesses. They must go and get a piece of white businesses. That needs to be reversed, and quickly, because this economy needs to grow, and it can only grow from black entrepreneurship. There's not enough whites to start enough businesses. That ship has sailed, and it won't change. We need to create a black entrepreneurial class. There was also, under the guise of BEE, a lot of what we are seeing in the news at all of these commissions. Why should I run a proper business if I can just go and buy this bottle for R1 and sell it on to the company for R20? Right? I'm going to make a lot of money. Who's running the company that makes this bottle of water? Well, more and more, we don't have black entrepreneurs that are getting into that space. And why should they? I've been an entrepreneur for most of my life, and I tell you what, it's a horrible business because you take a lot of risk, you get a lot of pressure put on you, you get SARS all over you, you get regulators, you get this, you get that. It's hard work with all of the risks associated. If somebody offers you a nice cushy job with a 7-figure salary, no risk, you flick from one company to another, salary goes up, why wouldn't you do it? If South Africa's game is to arrest its decline, its economic decline, we need to change the structure of this economy, and we need to change it fast. Okay, we cannot have an economy that doesn't produce stuff. And you're not going to produce stuff if your best talent is just going to go there to complete forms that say we need X number of black people in these positions, X number of colored people in this position. That's not going to grow the economy. But we've got to be careful of one thing. We've got to be very careful of the political class. The political class, their job is to protect the system that they have in place. Why? Because they, as we know from commission after commission after commission, it's not the minister who's running the business, it's the minister's wife, or in the case of the deputy president, his son. We have this kind of situation, and those people aren't running businesses as such. They are getting a portion, they're getting the tender, and somebody else is doing the job. We're running out of people to do the job. South Africa pays a 25% premium. Everything that the state pays for, everything that the state buys, they are prepared to pay 25% more than the going rate. It's ridiculous. Right? In a country that pays more than R1 billion interest per day on our debts, we pay over 400 billion rand in interest every year to service our debts. We can't afford a government that pays 25% more for this product than what they should be paying. South Africa needs to get efficient. Now, I don't see black people as a helpless people that need the crumbs off white tables. For starters, not enough white tables. And I see a highly entrepreneurial, creative people that should be starting their own business and should be given the incentives to start their own business. Right? We have seen so many cases of black success in this country. What we need to do is we need to run this economy as efficiently as possible. This BEE legislation has served its purpose. It had to do what it had to do, and it did it. We are now at the end of its usefulness, right? Those numbers I just said to you, where the population, 82% black, 8% colored, 7% white, 3% Indian. If you go and look at the age brackets over there, it's even more startling. You've got an aging, small white and Asian population. Small and aging. They are going to get less and less and less. That is not where our wealth lies. Our wealth lies with our young black population. We need to educate, incentivize, and let them run businesses. BEE stands in the way of that. So that's why I would say that the time has come 4B to say thank you very much for your service. You did what you did, good and bad, time to go. I hope this has helped. Subscribe to the State of the Nation channel. Go and rent a car from Pace Car Rental, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.